am super excited to share today's show with you. I brought back Arlis, who you remember from our Baja Day of the Dead in Mexico adventure, and today she's going to be taking us to Texas and New Mexico. We'll be going to Big Bend National Park and also to Carlsbad Caverns. And as you'll hear from her enthusiasm, this is a great adventure. So let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. On this show, I seek to inspire and empower you to lead a bigger life through adventure travel. Every other week, we go on an amazing adventure where we're either hiking, biking, or paddling our way around the U.S. or the world. And I'm super excited to bring Arlis back on the show. Welcome back to the show, Arlis.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
For those that haven't heard the first episode that we had you on, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into adventure travel?
Yes. Well, I got into adventure travel in 2017 was my first adventure trip, and it was to celebrate my 60th birthday. I did a whitewater rafting trip with Grand Canyon Whitewater, and we camped in the Grand Canyon and did whitewater rafting for 7 days. It was fantastic. And that started my desire to go and see and do things adventurously. And then I went to the Baja, and then this trip we started in El Paso and went to Big Bend and to Carlsbad Caverns, and we had a wonderful time.
The photos are amazing, and I encourage everybody to go to the website and check them out. But there's one thing that's going to be a nagging doubt for a lot of people. Border town, scary, Mexico, right now, all bad things. Can you let's address that elephant in the room first before we get going.
Right, because I told somebody about this trip and they said, "Oh, isn't that where the cartel is?" And I said, "Oh my goodness, no, not at all." First of all, I don't think people realize that Big Bend is a national park. And so it's 800,000 acres. It's the nation's 15th largest park. And it is on the border, but this is a canyon. If you've been to the Grand Canyon, this is a canyon. And so it's remote, and it's not easy for people to do business in. It is remote. So I never was afraid of that. There are people who live here, who work here, tourists come here and hike all over this national park all the time. So it was very, very safe, very safe.
And I'm guessing if you're trying to smuggle, whether people or drugs or whatnot, you're going to go an easier route than going up and down a canyon.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's no way to get a bunch of things across at this point in time. It's just too remote. It's a desert. So that's what a lot of people also is that Big Bend lies in the Chihuahuan Desert, and it's North America's largest desert. You don't want to be walking across this thing. The landscaping, the wildlife, the flora and fauna, it's not very conducive to just dragging a lot of stuff across a desert.
Okay, so we're thinking desert, hot and all that. So what's the appeal? Why? Well, let's do Big Bend first, and then we'll go the cavern. So the appeal, why go to Big Bend?
Well, first of all, I'm from Texas. If you don't recognize my accent, I'm from Texas, and it was a part of Texas that I had never seen before. And when you read about Big Bend, you get a lot of information about how beautiful it is. So I live on the east side of Texas, and it's very green and lush. And Big Bend is southwest in Texas, and it's a desert. And I've already discovered that I like to hike, and there's lots of hiking that goes on there, lots of wildlife. Birding is popular in Big Bend, and just an opportunity to see mountains because it is, again, I've done a little bit of homework here. It's the only national park to contain an entire mountain range. So the Chisos Mountains are in the national park. And it's just a great opportunity to see if you're into geology. There's so much to look at and see there just in Big Bend.
And I was surprised too. I lived in Texas and Houston many lifetimes ago, and I never thought of snow in Texas, but it actually can get cold there in winter, and you get snow.
I heard they got snow January the 3rd or 4th, and we were due there like 10 days after that. So kind of scurried around looking to what to wear. But yeah, it snowed in early January in Big Bend. It can get cold. That's considered part of their rainfall too. They only get 10 inches of rain in an entire year. So it can get cold, but it was beautiful when we were there. It was cool at night and 70 during the day. It was just perfect weather for us.
Okay, so a couple things. So when did you go?
But I went January. Oh, I have to look. Kit.
So, but you went in January. You went in January.
January, yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, and of course, in the travel plan, I'm going to have all the details of the best times to go and all the links and all that. But another thing you mentioned was the nights. Let's talk about the night sky too.
Oh, yes. Known for their beautiful night sky. Now, we stayed near Terlingua, and the Terlingua area is known for its Dark Night Sky Award. So in the notes that I got from Rhodes Scholar, Terlingua was awarded the Dark Night Sky Award and claims to have the darkest night skies in the lower 48. We saw the Milky Way. We saw shooting stars. Many of us had downloaded the app that you can hold your phone or your iPad up to the sky and it'll show you all the constellations. And we all had a wonderful time looking up at the dark night sky. It's just beautiful, just beautiful. And you can't see that in Houston because that's where I live. You cannot see that.
And also the Rangers lead lots of night sky programs. And so there's lots of things to do with the National Park Service, as well as if you're with a group or on your own. So that's kind of cool.
Right.
So let's drill down a little bit deeper about some of the things that you did. So you arrived in El Paso, then what?
Well, we arrived in El Paso, and El Paso's about 3 or 4 hours from the park. So that's the closest airport that's easy access. So we flew Southwest Airlines from Houston to El Paso, a nice nonstop flight. We spent the night in El Paso and met all of the participants and had a meet and greet. And then the next morning we got in, there were 24 participants in this program. We got in 2 12-passenger vans and headed out on our adventure. And we started by going to the Chihuahuan Desert. So on our way, we hiked the Hospital Canyon Trail. And that's where, and the Tall Grass Loop Trail. So I'm going on these trails and it's beautiful and rugged. And we see Fort Davis. So that's the first stop we made on our way into the park. We got to Fort Davis. We did some hiking. We had lunch. We toured the restored fort and then got back in our 12-passenger van and headed to our first hotel.
And I'm going to interrupt there too. There is nothing close to Big Bend. So if you're going to go there, you have to drive and you're going to have a car. There's no public transportation. It's either Odessa or El Paso. And then from there, you've got pretty much a day's drive to get there. So people are aware of that. They need to plan that when they're planning their vacation.
Right. And you really do have to do that. I mean, it's 6 hours from San Antonio, which is another major hub in Texas. There's just not a lot nearby. You also, I think, would very much have to plan far in advance, especially if you're going with a group. So in our case, we had 24 people. You have to set up a block of rooms from 12 to 18 rooms. And you're in Terlingua, Texas. There's not a lot out there. So, and the accommodations are, you're not staying at the Hyatt. You're staying in Terlingua, and the accommodations are simple. They do have, I did hear from the group guide that there are a lot of people who do Airbnb. So a lot of people who are making investments in Terlingua are making investments by building huts or small rooms and using them on Airbnb. But you still have to make plans to go far in advance.
Yeah, so there is one lodge and there's 3 campsites, one of which has RV full hookups.
Right, and a lot of people do RV in there. So you can Airbnb some of the smaller places. There is a lodge and it's always full. And in our case, again, going back to the fact that I was with Rhodes Scholar and we had 24 people with us, the lodge won't block out 12 to 18 rooms for a big group. So we were actually staying outside of the park at the Longhorn Ranch Motel. And it's a family-owned operation. One of the nice things about this hotel was they were on well water. So again, when you go to Terlingua, you have to understand that city water is a little bit it doesn't have a good reputation for working all the time. And our guide was telling us that if you're in an Airbnb and the city water decides to kind of give out that day, then the people who own the Airbnbs are bringing you in 5-gallon jugs of water to bathe and shower and do whatever, make coffee and whatever you need to do. So where we were staying at the Longhorn Ranch Motel, even though the accommodations were simple, we had well water, we had Wi-Fi, and it was a comfortable location. Not fancy, but comfortable.
So I guess the lodging is part of the adventure as well.
We thought so. Yeah. I mean, it was owned by a Mexican family, and we had hot breakfast every morning. They were very, very nice to all of us travelers.
Good. And one other thing, too, they do allow backcountry camping. You do need to get a permit, but it's free. All right, so let's talk about some of the activities that you did in Big Bend. So now you've made it to the park. So what do you do?
Well, fortunately, I go with a guide. So that's the way I like to adventure travel. One of the things that if you don't want to go with a group like I do, then make some plans to get some maps, get to the ranger station and get some advice on where to go or do your homework before you go. So we started out with a hike on the Native Americans Trail. It was the Homer Wilson Ranch Trail. It was an old line camp. So that was the first thing we did. And that was our first taste of the desert. And we are not the first travelers there in Big Bend. It was inhabited by Indians. And the first trail we took, or the first day we were there in Big Bend National Park, they took us into an area where it was called Native Americans Trail, and we got to see pictographs, petroglyphs, and metatates, traces of the Indians being there first.
And I had to look up, because in my mind, petroglyphs and pictographs were the same, but the petroglyphs are the carvings. The pictographs are when they're using like fat and iron oxide to do the drawings.
Right.
Usually more sheltered. So I had to get a mental, because to me, I was thinking the kind of the same thing, but they are different. And then what is that metadate? What's that?
It is, I sent you a picture of that. It's a rock with 3 big holes in it, but they're perfectly round. They look like bowls. And that's where the Indians ground their corn and ground their grain to make their food products.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure that's in the website as well. And so then also that same day, you also went to a ghost town. What was that like? First,
we went to Santa Elena Canyon.
That's
okay. What everybody thinks of is Santa Elena Canyon. It was a moderate hike, 1.8 miles with a 600-foot elevation gain. We got to see the towering 1,200 feet limestone rock cliff walls. And that's where people think of. I have a picture of that. It's a perfect V. The Rio Grande runs right through it. Mexico's on one side. The United States is on the other side. Unfortunately, it was too muddy that day for us to actually take that particular hike. So again, what's nice about traveling with a guide who's familiar with the area is they know the conditions are not conducive. We would have all been up to our knees in mud. And so we went in and we looked at that particular location, and then we chose a different hike to hike on that day. But it was beautiful, and we got to see that and then take an alternative hike. The point is that 120 miles of the Rio Grande wind through the whole park, and that's what you're looking at. It's beautiful. And another thing you can do in Big Bend on the Rio Grande is they have rafting trips and canoe trips that you can actually get in the water and travel on the Rio Grande. There are guides that have companies that will do that for you.
That's actually, when I thought of Big Bend before I was doing homework for this interview, that was my vision, was doing the rafting of Big Bend. That's the thing I was most familiar with. But there's tons of trails. They've got 11 desert trails, 7 mountain trails, and 5 river hikes. So that's quite a bit for those that like to hike. There's lots of opportunity there.
Yes, it is. So we did see We had dinner at the historic Starlight Theater that night, and that's when we toured the Terlingua town, the ghost town. I think they give that name as a ghost town because of its history in mining. Mm-hmm. And then when mining went away, everybody left and Terlingua became a ghost town. I wrote some notes about that as I was looking. So the miners left because they were mining mercury. And when that went out of fashion, then the miners left and went back to Mexico, and Terlingua was left with no citizens in there, and it became a ghost town.
Gotcha.
And that's how I got that name, the Terlingua ghost town. But unfortunately, mercury is not something that's fun to work with, and left a lot of the miners sick, and it went out of fashion, and they stopped producing, and they left, and it became a ghost town until someone came in, and I think the 60s discovered it again. And I think it was about 1968 or so when Terlingua had their first chili cook-off. And now when we were having dinner at the Starlight Theater, they have bands that come to play, and you can really see the eclectic people who live in Terlingua. It's quite an interesting town. People who live in Terlingua really want to do their own thing, because in Terlingua, and we'll talk about this as we talk about, I guess, some of the more exploring we did around Terlingua and the type of people who live there, because we did get to do an off-the-grid visit to a man who had built 2 houses out there and lives completely off the grid.
Yeah, it sounds like an eclectic mix of extreme individualism. Where they're funky.
It was, and that was the next day we got to witness funky. But it was fun because all of us who toured this young man's house, and he wasn't an old guy, he was probably 40, and he had built one house that he uses as an Airbnb, and then he built his own house, all using things from the land that he had gathered up. A lot of people are building with adobe. They make it themselves. They had a whole discussion about how to make walls of your house, how to collect water for your house, how to collect solar energy for your house. I didn't include any pictures because he really preferred us not to discuss where it was he lives, because he really likes to be off the grid. But it was very interesting to see all the things that he had done in his house to heat his house, to make sure it was cool, how to cook. I think the water collection system amazed both of us. And I will say this about living off the grid, and we talked about it when I was saying, water isn't really reliable out in Terlingua and in the Big Bend Park. So you can't just turn on the water and let it run while you're brushing your teeth. Everybody is concerned with saving water. When you only get 10 inches of rain a year, it's a thing. So one morning we woke up to the sound of rain. It was 4:00 in the morning. I woke up, I heard it raining. And the first thing I thought of was, oh good, all of those folks are getting water. They drain off their roofs into their collection systems and into these giant, for lack of a better word, giant barrels that they keep outside their homes, collecting water that will keep them in water all year long. So it left me with a real appreciation of how lucky I am to be able to go into my bathroom, turn on the sink, let the water run as much as I want till it's nice and hot, wash my face, and go on. We were left with a much better understanding of how to live conscientiously when something isn't plentifully available.
Definitely. And this is not down. This is on the day of your visit with the guy. You're up at 1,300 elevation, right? And there's trees and all that. So it's not like barren desert. This is where there's vegetation even.
Right.
Still they suffer. Yeah,
that was day 4 when we went into the Chisos Mountains and the Lost Mine Trail. That was our most challenging trail. If I could take a side note here, and because I listened to your podcast, Kit, about how to choose a travel company. And I think this is a point in time where I really want to make sure people know, and you explained it in that podcast, you have to review your itinerary carefully. This itinerary was perfectly suited for me. I live at sea level. I'm not an experienced hiker, although I'm getting better. But some of the hikers that went along with us were disappointed that they didn't hike longer, farther, and more difficult hikes. And with all due respect to my new friends, I felt like the itinerary was very clearly explained how far we'd be hiking, what our elevation would be, because it says on this Lost Mine Trail, it was a 4.8 mile challenging hike with a 1,300 foot elevation gain. Well, for a Houstonian, that was a challenging hike for me. But for my friends from, say, Vermont, that was just a nice little walk to them. So when you're deciding where to go and what you're going to do, read the itinerary carefully and make sure that it suits your needs. If you want more, look for something that has 15-mile hikes with 3,000 elevation gains. I don't know as I could have kept up with that. My little side note about how to pick a company and an itinerary that suits your needs. But it was beautiful, and the amazing views of Chisos Basin were just incredible. And again, an experienced guide. Our guide's name's Erica. She lives in Terlingua 10 months out of the year. She lives a couple of months out of the year in her home state of Tennessee. She and her husband, Jimmy, and her sister, Erica, own the company that Road Scholar contracted with. And she did everything for us, even from stopping at a plant that was edible. She pulled the buses off to the side of the road and gathered up some of these plants and berries, and we all had samples and explained how it was used and when it was blooming. I like that in a guide. I want to know about how people live there. Tell me about the trees and the bushes and the cactuses and the animals and what goes on there day to day. So another way to choose a company is make sure your guide is experienced in the area.
Definitely.
But that was our most challenging hike for me, was the most challenging one because of the elevation gain. And like I said, for others, they didn't think it was that challenging, but the views were spectacular.
And that's what I hike for. I hike for beauty.
Views, I do too, Kit. It's great to be challenged. I'm all about that from time to time, but I want to stand there and look at the glory in front of me. And my heart rate doesn't have to get real high to see the glory of what we have to see in our world.
Yeah, and conversely, if my heart rate's going to get really high and I'm going to work really hard, there better be something pretty at the top of that mountain.
I agree. So then we had a sack lunch at the top of the mountains. It was just beautiful. We had all packed our sack lunches before we headed up there. Lots of pictures, lots of looking around and explaining what we were seeing and the mountain range around us, and then hiked back down. We always had plenty of time down in the basins to go to the lodges or the visitor centers and look for books and literature and plenty of restroom breaks. And it was just a really fun day. And that was the night that we all sat around and had a wonderful homemade lasagna dinner and looked at the stars. It was a great end to a really fun day.
That does sound nice. I wanted to mention, too, that you've got to bring a lot of water on these hikes, too, I would think.
Yes, and that's one thing that I'm going to do the next time I go on a hike is I have a new backpack that will accommodate one of those pouches that slides.
Oh, yeah, those bladders are lovely. Yeah.
The bladders. I haven't done that yet, but that's my next purchase, because to me, carrying 3 liters of water, if you carry it in bottles or plastic bottles, it's very difficult. It's uncomfortable on your backpack. And the bladder slits there will give you all the water you need, and it sits comfortably in your backpack. And so you're not trying to shift the weight around, because that can be kind of annoying. But yes, our guides made sure there was plenty of ice water on our buses to get started. We had 2 guides. We had Erica in the front for the fast walkers that were heading up fast, and then our substitute guide, because our expected guide was not feeling well, so we had a substitute, a lovely man named Ronnie. He was in the back, and he swept up for those who wanted to stop, like me, who might need to stop and let their heart rate kind of regulate. Our age group was diverse, everything from 56 to about 80, I suspect. Not sure exactly how old our older ones were, but 70s and maybe late 70s. So everybody was able to make the hike, but as you do in a group, some people are really fast and some people need to take their time. And I thought our guides were very respectful of the different abilities in our group.
Good, good. So the next day you're actually crossing the border. What happened there?
Yes. Now that was, I think everybody was looking forward to that. So we got up and we headed to the Boquillos Canyon, which was a wonderful hike, and got to see a bunch of beautiful rock cliff walls and saw some birds. And then we got down to the Pebble Beach on the Rio Grande, and that's the picture of all of us standing as a group. That was a great opportunity. And then we walked to the port of entry. It's the only Class B port of entry on the Mexican border. And they kept saying the ferry that we would take. Well, my travel friend Carol had been there before, so she was kind of chuckling under her breath. The ferry is an aluminum boat rowed by a Mexican gentleman, and they have these aluminum boats going back and forth. It's only 50 feet wide. You could throw rocks across it. It's really not that far. And for a long time, that border was open there. So people would just walk across when the water's low. They were just walking back and forth. And Boquillos, Mexico was a big town. And then after 9/11, they closed the border, and all unofficial border crossings were closed. And so Boquillos, Mexico became a bit of a ghost town. And then after 2013, the U.S. authorities reopened that, and Boquillos, Mexico is now on a rebound. So, well, if you can call 200 citizens a rebound. But they had children and a small school and a little church. So we go down there, we get on our boat, and we row across, and we get off on the Mexican side. And it's about a 2-mile walk into town. Some rode burros. I included a picture of that. And some of us took a nice dusty walk into the town. And again, you come away with a real appreciation of what other people have and you have, and how they see life as normal and how you see life as normal. But we walked across and saw the Rio Grande, had a wonderful Mexican food lunch, met some lovely people of the town. We were serenaded by a gentleman who serenaded us, and we bought some touristy little trinkets from the ladies who do their own embroidery. Had a few margaritas and some Cokes, and then rode ourselves back across we check in. You do check in before you come back. So they have a little kiosk where you slide your passport in there. The phone rings, you pick up the phone, it says, the gentleman on the other end said, "What are you bringing back?" And I said, "I'm bringing back a t-shirt." And he said, "Okay, thank you for visiting." And you hang up the phone and you get rowed back across into Texas. It was fun. It was very fun. It's not very fancy, but it's certainly interesting. That's for sure.
And you felt perfectly safe in Boquillos.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Children in school swinging on swing sets, just like us, except a lot smaller and a lot different kind of a school environment. They have one school room, literally, for all the children in the town. All the grades are taught. One teacher who teaches there. They do have solar power, but they don't have running toilets there. So it's an interesting town to visit. But we had a good time, and they were very welcoming to us. They love tourists. That's how they make their living.
So then the next day, now we're going to one of your funky towns, Marfa. Let's talk about that.
Well, if you blink, you'll miss it. So this was another traveling day. So we were heading from Big Bend. Oh, and one more thing I'd like to say about Big Bend, and I'm making fun of myself when I say this. So I've lived in Texas all my life, right? My mother is a daughter of the Republic of Texas. We talked a lot about the history of Texas and how Texas and Mexico and the Six Flags, and we had all this fun discussion about Texas. And it never once occurred to me how Big Bend got its name. So Big Bend is where the Rio Grande makes the big bend on its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And I thought, well, why did it take me a lifetime to figure that out? But that's Big Bend. The Rio Grande makes a big bend as it heads down to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's my story about Big Bend. That my friend and I got a real laugh about that. So yes, so this is another travel day, day 6. We get in our vans and we leave and we drive through Alpine, Marfa, and Van Horn. Now, Alpine's where the people of Big Bend will drive to go for groceries. So that brings up another thing when you're traveling in a place like Big Bend and you think, well, I'll just run out and grab a salad, or I'll just run to Chick-fil-A and get some takeout. You can't do that. That's when you're having to leave your home in Terlingua, Big Bend, wherever, and go 80 miles to Alpine to get groceries. You don't just run out and get something else. So food options, you need to really consider where you're staying and what you have available. And if you're RVing, bring your supplies in because you're not entering a big town. These folks have to really plan ahead as to what their restaurants are stocking, what's stocked in your home because your nearest grocery store is 80 miles away in Alpine. Another thing to consider if this is really your kind of trip. But it was a fun trip, and we got to stop at that funky store that's out in the middle of nowhere in a cow pasture. Yeah, the Prada store. And all of us took pictures, and at the little Prada store, stopped and got some wonderful breakfast tacos on the way, and then got to the Guadalupe Mountains. We stopped at the Frijoli Ranch Historic Site and had lunch. Oftentimes, because we were traveling or hiking, lunch was a sack lunch that we packed that morning, or our guides would prepare salad for us and sandwiches. So it wasn't a restaurant meal, but it was a perfectly lovely on-the-road, roadside picnic meal. And
I want to ask you about that Prada store. I saw the photo, and it looks like Prada. What is that?
You know, it's just it's an exhibition. It's an art installation. It's not a store. It's an art installation. And there are a lot of these things along in Marfa. And we didn't spend a lot of time in these towns, unfortunately, but it's something that a lot of artists are moving to places like Marfa so that they can create and have an area where they can create. And it's very free to do what you want to do and be who you want to be. Lots of wide open land to do installations of all different kinds. So I encourage people who are artists, are interested in that kind of thing, to look into traveling out to Marfa to see some of the eclectic works that are done out there. It is an art installation. So all it is a big box with glass front windows filled with Prada purses and shoes. You can't go in, you can't buy it, you just look at it and take a picture of it.
How funny. And I heard there's like a food truck that's an area of just funky RVs and trucks and all that selling food somewhere in Marfa. That's just like almost like a rodeo of food trucks.
We didn't get to see that. But see, that's another reason. I would say Marfa is one of those kind of places that if you weren't quite ready to go all the way to Big Bend, take a trip to Marfa. Find a place out there. A lot of people go there because it is funky and there's lots of different kinds of people out there. We didn't, unfortunately, spend a lot of time in Marfa.
So that's en route to the Guadalupe Mountains National Park. Okay.
You're right. Guadalupe Mountains National Park, en route to that.
Okay.
And we stopped at the Frijoli Ranch, and that's where we saw javelina. So that's another thing.
Oh, okay. That's like the little pig, right?
Yes. And they were just rooting around there at our campsite when we were touring that little historic area and having our picnic lunch. You just walk right by, and there's 3 or 4 of them standing there eating grass and doing what javelina pigs do. Wildlife is everywhere. We got to see, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of that bighorn sheep that we saw. So there were two of them. And again, our guide was explained this. So there's one that's native to the area and one that is not native to the area. One has curled horns, one has straight horns. And these are the things that guides explain to you. And so as you're rolling along, our guide, the lead guide, Erica, if she spotted something, we'd pull off to the side of the road and everybody would get to look at what was out there. So we saw the sheep, we saw the javelina, we saw roadrunner. It was really something. We didn't get to see as many birds as we had hoped to, but we did get to see a lot of cactus in bloom, and the creosote bushes were out, mesquite bushes, just beautiful, beautiful flora and fauna.
Cool. And for this travel day too, they broke it up with a little bit of hiking as well.
Yes, and that was one thing that I liked. So you weren't in your bus for a long, long time. Another thing you pointed out on that wonderful podcast of yours about how to pick a tour guide and how to pick a tour company is look at the itinerary and see if they break it up. Because one thing I don't want to do ever is I don't want to be in a bus, especially a big bus full of 50 people traveling long, long, long distances to go jump out of the bus and take a picture of something. We would actually stop, like where we had lunch, we would stop, we'd have our lunch, and then we'd go on a hike. Then we'd get back in our bus and go to our next destination, which was Carlsbad Caverns National Park.
And what you said is, to me, that's critical, because some trips, just by the very nature of whatever the destination is, you're going to have travel days. It's what does the company do with those travel days? Are you getting out and doing fun hikes, or are you just taking a pit stop and getting back on the bus?
Right. And which Marfa was a pit stop. To be honest with you, we didn't have time to look around very much, because most of the people, I would think, I didn't ask this specifically, but I can only speak for myself. If I had the choice to take a hike or look around a town, I was actually there to hike. So we did a lot of hiking, but I would like to go back and look around the town of Marfa.
And while I'm thinking of it too, if you're driving yourself out in this area, you want to make sure you're keeping your fuel tank topped up and keep lots of water in case you break down, both to help cool off your radiator. Also, in case you do break down, you want water so you don't get dehydrated until help for somebody. So that's really, really important in this kind of an area. And
Wi-Fi signals and use of phones. There were many of us that for long periods of time didn't have use of our phone because we didn't have Wi-Fi. So you want to download an app. What's that app that you download for Wi-Fi calling? WhatsApp.
Yes.
A lot of people had, and I did not, but I will next time for sure, download the app WhatsApp so you can make calls when Wi-Fi signal might not be as reliable.
I thought you still needed Wi-Fi to use WhatsApp. No?
You do, but for some reason, like for me, my phone didn't have reception in that area. It probably had to do with my carrier in Houston.
Did your bus have Wi-Fi?
Did not. And our hotel had Wi-Fi, but it was a little bit, if everybody's on it, then it's a little bit slow.
So let's talk about Carlsbad Caverns.
Wow.
That I want to see. That's been on my wish list as long as I can remember.
Amazing. Just amazing. Many people have said they've been, but for some reason I didn't get the memo. And it was worth the trip. Absolutely worth the trip. So there are different ways to get into the caverns. They have an elevator that rides you down, that you can ride down. It's a 1.5 mile loop around what they call the big room. So it requires a lot of effort to get into the canyon. We walked into the canyon and it is absolutely a zigzag, 1.5 miles down into the canyon. I had on great hiking boots that were non-slip, and they also have it paved because it's damp, wet, and cool inside there. They have handrails. It's well lit. The people who are in wheelchairs, we saw people in wheelchairs being pushed into the canyon down the ramp. You can get to a certain point and then you can look at some things and then you have to exit because it's not 100% wheelchair accessible, but it certainly is accessible to anyone who might have issues with vision. So it's lit. There are plenty of handrails. The trails are paved with a non-stick rock of some kind, so everybody was safe. Even those of us, we had people on our trip who had visual problems, acuity issues, maybe needing to have their cataracts replaced. Some people were ready for cataract surgery, and that leaves your vision a little blurry. So the dim lights were difficult, but the handrails made them feel safe. We had one girl on our trip who was claustrophobic, and she wasn't sure she was going to be able to get in there. What she didn't realize when we got in there was this is gigantic. You're not in a tiny cave, which I did when I explored a cave in Canada, in the Canadian Rockies. We were in small crawl spaces. You're not in a cave like that. It is a wide open cave. And she made the whole trip down and all the way through the big room without a bit of problems. Take your camera. You can take pictures. They do ask you to whisper, because it's not, they don't want everybody talking real loud. It's very reverent in there. It is just amazingly beautiful. Now, the bats were not there. They do have bats that come into the cave, but they're seasonal in the summer, so we were not greeted with bats. So if you're someone who's concerned about seeing bats, that's not going to be a problem in there. And when the bats are there, they route you around because they don't want the humans bothering them.
And also, they will not let you do the cameras or any electronics at all because it affects the bats.
Yes. So we didn't see the bats. They weren't there, but I took a ton of pictures. I probably took 100 pictures everywhere you turn. Everywhere you turn. Stalactites, stalagmites, curtains, straws. It was just unbelievable, and worth the trip from wherever you are to go there.
A couple things. So the bats are there late May through October, and then they have all sorts of bat programs too. And then also, I think it's Roy Rogers, but I may be attributing this wrong, but somebody said that Carlsbad Cavern is like the Grand Canyon with a roof on it.
I can see that, Kit. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just have got to see that before I die.
Definitely. Yes. It is beautiful. And it's an afternoon. It's not, to me, it's not hard. Now, once you get down, you walking down in some of those trails down, and it's a paved trail back and forth all the way down, a switchback, if you will. Some of them are pretty steep, so you need to make sure you can walk down like that. And then if you're really into it, you can walk back up. But I was mighty glad to see that elevator when we were done. I did not walk back out of the caverns, but it is available if you want to walk back out. You can do that. But I have my notes in front of me, speleotherms of Carlsbad Caverns, the columns, the soda straws, the draperies, the curved branching formations that defy gravity known as helicities. Maybe I said that wrong. Popcorn. They have all kinds of different handouts that you can get so you can look for the different formations that are inside the caverns. Again, well lit and well labeled. So as you're walking upon something, there will be a sign that explains what it is, how it was formed, and just bring your camera. It is amazing.
So how was it formed? Was this an ancient river?
So again, they have a beautiful visitor center. Please bring money. You're going to want to buy souvenirs in this visitor center. It is beautiful. It's vast, and they have a lot of information. They also have audio that you can wear. I saw some of the guests that were there that day wearing headsets, so you can have that experience as well. And in the information that I brought home, it says, the geologic story of Carlsbad Cavern began 265 million years ago with the creation of a 400-mile-long horseshoe-shaped reef. The reef stretched along the shelf edge of the inland sea that covered southeast New Mexico and West Texas. Unlike reefs today, this one was composed mostly of sponges and algae. As each generation grew atop its ancestors, pressure compressed the underlying reef into limestone, and several million years later, tectonic uplift cut off the inland sea from the vast ocean to the west, and cracks developed in the reef rock as it rose above sea level. And it goes on and on about that. Around 15 to 20 million years ago, tectonic movements started pulling the southwest region of this continent apart. So it's a lot of limestone. You could see where water dripped slowly from the ceiling, soda straws and larger stalactites appeared. Water falling onto the floor created stalagmites. And sometimes when a stalactite and a stalagmite met and formed a column, draperies hung where water ran down a slanted ceiling. Flowstone formed where water flowed over the surface of a wall or a floor while depositing layers of calcite. Cave pearls, lily pads, and rimstone dams appeared where pools of water occurred in the cave. It's impressive, to say the least. It's impressive.
I want to go. I also want to go when the bats are there because I think that is fascinating. I want to do both because you can't take pictures when the bats are there. So you may want to do both. Go twice. Right. Yeah. And one thing too,
when the bats leave the cave, can you imagine out of the cave, thousands of bats flying together towards the southeast to feed in the Pecos and Black River valleys where they gorge on moths and other night-flying insects. Yeah.
And the rangers have programs in a dawn program for when they're coming back in from the night, and then a dusk program when they're leaving for the night. So the rangers have got some really cool programs that you want to make sure that you go to. They won't let you reserve in advance. You can go there the day of and sign up. And that's and there's limited spaces, but that has got to be super cool. And I'm sure you can still see them. You just won't have the ranger interpretation unless you get one of those 25 slots.
You know, that's another thing that when I was on this trip that I didn't quite appreciate until it was almost done. What nice rangers we have in these national parks. Their passion for the park is very obvious. They're wonderful resources of information, first of all. That's pretty obvious. But they're just really genuinely nice men and women who want to answer your questions and want to share with you what they love about the national parks. A wonderful resource. Don't overlook that at all. And they're all there at Carlsbad Caverns just waiting to help you have a wonderful experience.
Yeah, and I find that across all the parks. Probably because they have such a nice office to work in.
Yes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really happy too.
Yeah.
Just look at that every day.
I know. So we had a wonderful 3-mile hike, 1.5 miles down, 1.5 miles around the big room, passing all those stunning formations, and then an elevator ride to the top, a wonderful walk around the visitor center and the museum, which is worth it. And then we went to dinner and checked into our hotel. And I don't know about anybody else, but I slept like a baby that night.
I'll bet. A couple more things I want to mention about Carlsbad. Year-round temperatures in the cavern is 56 degrees Fahrenheit, so you always want to make sure you're bringing a sweater or a jacket because it's going to be a little chilly, even in the heat of the desert day in the summertime. And then also in the park itself, this is the one that has no overnight lodging. You're allowed to primitive camp with a free permit, but there are no campsites. There's no RV sites, so you'll have to stay outside the park in order to do so.
Right.
So then after that, what happens?
Well, we checked into the Hampton Inn that night. So a lot of people were really kind of glad to see, quote unquote, civilization because we were in Carlsbad, New Mexico. So we had left Texas and gone to New Mexico. It's very close right there. And also another thing about our trip was El Paso is mountain time, but Big Bend is central time. So we were always careful about where we were in mountain and central time. Our guides helped us know where we were and what time it was. And then that night in Carlsbad, which we slept in a very nice place. Carlsbad is a nice small city, if you will, and you can stock up on things that you might need while you're there. And then the next morning we got up, it was almost over, and took what I thought one of our most beautiful hikes. So the group that I was hiking with, there were 24 of us. And it goes back again, Kit, to what you had talked about in your podcast about what kind of trip do you want to take. For me, I will never take a trip of more than 24 people. because I think 24 or less people is just enough people to get to know folks, to know their names. We were in two 12-passenger buses, so everybody could have conversation. It allowed us a lot of flexibility in a quote-unquote smaller group. And I enjoyed that number of people. So I left with names and numbers and friendships and have a lot of nice people that I've gotten to know. So I encourage people to really investigate that. So that was one of the things that I enjoyed about that. So we picked up and we went to the Guadalupe Mountains National Park and we hiked in McKittrick Canyon. And the reason I talk about the size of the group is because Erica, our group leader, by then had gotten to know us. We were a pretty active group. So we were hiking quickly. There was nobody in our group that needed special accommodations. Generally, some of us, like me, maybe hiked a little bit slower, and some hiked a little bit faster. But generally, we were all pretty well matched physically. So when we got to our hike, it was a 4.8 trail in McKittrick Canyon Trail, and there was another trail that wasn't on the itinerary, but because we were always so fast, she added that 2-mile trip onto our itinerary. So we had a 7-mile hike that day, and it was beautiful. So McKittrick Canyon Trail follows the spring-fed creek. So we got to see water again. We saw wildlife. That's where we saw the sheep. We saw the historic Pratt Cabin, which was built in 1936. We had a lovely lunch there and met some other hikers. And then we went to the Pinery Butterfield Stagecoach Ruins. And it was a relay station on the Butterfield Overland Mail Route, which in 1857 had the first letter to travel from east to west by means other than steamship sailing around South America. So we had a wonderful hike, and I sent you a picture of the scenery there because they also have maple trees in there. This was a hike that was much more densely populated with trees and forests, as we tend to think. When people think about hiking in a mountain, you think about trees and forests and flora and fauna, but these creeks and arroyos were just beautiful, beautiful hike. It was not strenuous, meaning it didn't go up real high. It was not an elevation gain. In fact, they didn't even list an elevation gain on this, but it was distance. And it was rocky, so you really had to watch where you were going and be careful nonetheless, but it was beautiful. Just a wonderful way to end a great, great day. And then our picnic lunch, and we hiked back all the way and saw our visitor center. We always stopped at the visitor center to get brochures and things like that.
So you are well-traveled. How would you put this adventure compared to some of your other adventures?
I'm glad you asked that. Road Scholar is a not-for-profit organization. This was my first trip with Road Scholar. I am a second-generation Road Scholar traveler. My parents traveled with Road Scholar when it was known as Elder Hostel.
That's what I thought. It used to be Elder Hostel.
Yes, it used to be Elder Hostel. And Elder Hostel was started, if my research shows me correctly, they would take travelers who were interested in learning experiences and go to university towns and occupy the dorm rooms that were unoccupied in the summer. So as it became known as the hostel, Elder Hostel, and it was for travelers 55 and older. Well, now they call it Road Scholar. They've dropped the age requirement, although most travelers are 50 and above, most are. They have a lot of grandchildren trips. They travel all over the world. But how this compared with others is the price point of Road Scholar is generally a lower price point than, say, some of the other trips I've taken, like to the Grand Canyon and to the Canadian Rockies and to the Mexican Baja. And how I see that working out is the food offerings were different and the accommodations were different. So my accommodations were not as luxurious as some of the others I've stayed in. The food perhaps was not as luxurious as some of the other food I've been offered on trips. But what I like about it most was I love the educational aspect of Road Scholar. And frankly, I like the price point of Road Scholar because it allows me to use my travel budget going on more trips. So I was traveling this time with a lot of single travelers, a lot of couples who had traveled a lot with Road Scholar. Their travel budgets go further. They like the educational aspect of traveling with a group like this. So again, perhaps it wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but it certainly was something I very much enjoyed. I would be very careful when I travel with Road Scholar in the future because I don't want to travel with a group larger than 24. And
yeah, that was my biggest thing about this whole trip. I was like, 24, that's a big group. I usually try to keep it like 12 or under.
Right.
So but they broke it in 2 vans, which I think was smart on their part.
Right. It broke into 2 vans. And that's another thing. If that's not your cup of tea, then you need to know what the size of group is before you go. I thought it was manageable, but I wouldn't want it to be more. And in Road Scholar world, and again, I don't work for them, but I understand that 24 is considered a small group in Road Scholar, where they will have groups that are upwards of, 50.
Where they'll fill the bus. Yeah.
Where they'll fill the bus.
Yeah.
So you have to know that before you go. But 24 for me was manageable. People met like-minded travelers while they were there. Carol and I travel a lot together, and we met a wonderful couple of girlfriends that travel a lot together from Georgia, and we really enjoyed meeting other women and other couples that were interesting and had different perspectives on things. And some people thought the trip was too basic. They thought it could have been more, they wanted their hikes to be longer, and they wanted their hikes to be more strenuous.
And I would say, too, if you've got 24 people, they can't possibly make it strenuous because they know there'll be people that couldn't do it.
Well, exactly. Road Scholar, I think, is working on how to make that more clear. So they list things as hike at your own pace. So they'll have a lead hiker. Erica would go up fast, and those who could follow her up fast were right behind her. And then Ronnie swept it up behind for those of us who wanted to maybe stop. It wasn't strenuous. We just might want to stop and take pictures more often. We had one gentleman who had 2 hip replacements, and he was keeping up with the rest of us, but walking a little slower. Another lady who, like me, was from a town sea level, and we just had to walk slower because our bodies weren't accustomed to the elevations. But it's a challenge to figure out what is active to me might not be active to others. Or as my friend Bob from Vermont said, well, that was a nice little walk. And I was just thinking I had done a marathon for me.
And so I want to, you've mentioned it several times in this episode about finding the right fit tour company for you. So I will put a link to that in the show notes because I think that's probably one of the most important episodes I've done because that could make a really expensive mistake if you get the wrong tour company for you and it's not the right fit.
Right.
I mean, I certainly found that in Morocco.
Absolutely.
I loved Morocco, loved the people, loved everything. I just was on the wrong tour.
Right.
And that's so I was unhappy.
I think that might have happened in the case with, there were some travelers on this trip that were a little disappointed. They didn't think the food was what they expected it to be, and they didn't think the hikes were aggressive enough. And yet for me and my travel friend, we were perfectly and absolutely satisfied with what we had. We felt like we absolutely got our money's worth. And traveling with a group like Road Scholar allows you to use your travel budget in a budget-friendly way and see the world. So
and that's how they're getting the price down is because they're not giving you the gourmet food or the, you might be at a 2.5 star instead of a 3-star, and
exactly.
The larger group allows them to spread out the cost of the guide over more people. So it's a trade-off and you just got to pick what works for you.
Absolutely. But I will travel with Road Scholar again, and I look forward to it. And I've been in touch with one of my friends. We were talking about hiking shoes, and she's already booked 2 more trips with Road Scholar for the year because she's a university professor, travels during her spring break and her summers. And this allows her to travel when she wants to, see the United States in a budget-friendly way and go to more places.
Now, did you talk to anybody personally, or was everything just done on their website? Some like Adventure Women, you can call and actually talk to somebody about the trip.
Oh, you can call and talk to somebody. And Erica's number was listed on the website, and she has an email. I don't remember if it's on Road Scholar website or not, But I do remember when I got my introductory packet, Erica's number was in there and I could have called her. So I would imagine
that's post, you've already bought the trip.
I've already bought the trip.
Yeah. I'll look into that and I'll put that in the show notes because Road Scholar I only know because my parents have also done it, but I have no affiliation with them. And I know that the destinations are great, but there are some, like you said, it's a trade-off on certain of the activities.
Exactly.
To find out whether or not you can actually talk to a person to make sure it's the right fit for you, because I'm going to be beating that drum a lot because it's really important to make sure that you're having the experience that you want to have when you finally have time to go on vacation.
Right. Well, I did make one phone call when I was deciding on which trip to make, because there was one trip that was more aggressive, were longer hikes, and there was this trip. And as it turned out, the one with the longer hikes was full. And so I picked this trip, which suited me perfectly. And I did talk to someone at Road Scholar.
Okay, good. So we'll know that then. All right, good. So where are you going to next? What's on Arlis's agenda?
Arlis's agenda. Well, my husband and I are going to take a cruise in April, and I live very close to Galveston, Texas, and that's a big cruise port now here in Texas, and we're going to go on a luxurious cruise into the Caribbean in April. And then I am going with my friend Carol and 4 more good friends from the Houston area. We all went to the Canadian Rockies together. We're going in June with a group called Canyon Calling. It's an all-women travel group, and we're going to hike and adventure in the Big 5 national parks in Utah.
Very fun. That's going to be a blast. I love the Utah parks. They're gorgeous.
My first time.
Wait till you see it. You're going to think you're on Mars. It's unbelievable. We'll get you back on the show for that, because that is just, it's going to blow you away.
I've heard. Well, just the pictures on the internet are amazing. So this is a small group travel that I'm going with, all women, and that's something that I have discovered. Not that co-ed group was lovely and we made some wonderful friends, but I do like women traveling. I do like women travel groups, and I do prefer and am willing to spend the money on a smaller group. So this is like 14 people. You pay a little more for that privilege, if you will, and I'm willing to do that, and we're really looking forward to it.
Well, I can't wait to hopefully get you back on and talk about that. So
I'd be happy to.
I appreciate you coming on the show, Arlis. It's always a blast talking to you about your adventures. I love following you on Facebook. You do all these fun things. I'm like, I want that life.
Yeah. Well, along with it comes a lot of other stuff, as you know, Kit.
I know. We only post the good stuff, right?
I know. Social media scrub.
I know, indeed. Well, it's great having you on again, and look forward to chatting with you again.
Thank you, Kit. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right, you too. I just love that woman. Her enthusiasm about travel and adventure travel just rocks my boat, and I hope that I get to travel with you sometime, Arlis. So we were talking about Big Bend and Carlsbad. The distance between the two driving-wise is around 4 hours, so it does make a good tie-in if you have the time to visit both the parks. I do want to make a correction, too. It was Will Rogers and not Roy Rogers who said that Carlsbad Cavern was like the Grand Canyon with a roof on it, so I want to clarify that. I'd like to ask you a favor. Could you please email me at kit@activetraveladventures.com and let me know which of the things that I do for this program, whether it's the podcast, the website, the travel planners, etc., that you actually use. I've got to figure out some way that this whole production that I'm doing takes less time. And I have no way of tracking who's doing what other than downloads of the podcast. So if there's some way you could tell me what you're getting benefit out of, so if there's something I can trim, I'll figure out how to do that. So if you would please, again, it's kit@activetraveladventures.com. I would love your feedback anyway on what I'm doing here, whether you're getting something out of it, is this a priority for you to listen to the show, what you'd like to see me do. I'm just kind of revamping and regrouping and redoing the website, and your feedback would be most appreciated. Again, thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.